guns. Then there were a number of small protected cruisers, built in Japanese dockyards since the Chinese War, the heralds of the later time when the Japanese Navy would all be home built. Battleships, armored cruisers, and protected cruisers were all swifter than the Russian ships. The fleet as a whole could maneuver at fully 50% greater speed than the enemy, and this meant that it could choose its own position in battle. The 5 torpedo squadrons included 2 or 3 torpedo gunboats, 21 fine destroyers, and some 80 torpedo boats. Togo's plans had the simplicity which is a necessity in the rough game of war, where elaborate schemes are likely to go wrong. Some of the swift protected cruisers were scouting south of the straits. The fleet was anchored in a body in Masampho Bay, and in wireless communication with its scouts. The armoured fleet was to make the main attack on the head of the Russian advance. The protected cruiser squadrons were to sweep round the enemy's flanks, fall upon his rear, and destroy his transports and auxiliaries. The torpedo flotilla was to be ready to dash in and complete the defeat of the enemy when his fleet was crippled by the fight with the heavy ships. Most of the officers and men of the Russian fleet had the dogged courage that could carry them through even a hopeless fight, but they looked forward to the immediate future with forebodings of disaster. Even among the officers on board the great Suvaroff, there was a feeling that the most that could be hoped for was that a few ships would struggle through to Vladivostok if there was a battle, and that the best thing that could happen would be for the thick weather and rough seas to enable them to avoid anything like a close fight with the Japanese. During the last day before the fight, Rojdestvensky, who did not want to hurry forward, but was timing his advance so as to pass the straits in the middle of the next day, spent some time in manoeuvres. Captain Semenoff's notes on the proceedings convey a useful lesson. "Once again," he says, "and for the last time, we were forcibly reminded of the old truism that a fleet is created by long practice at sea in time of peace, cruising, not remaining in port, and that a collection of ships of various types, hastily collected, which have only learned to sail together on the way to the theatre of operations, is no fleet, but a chance concourse of vessels." Wireless telegraphy had come into use since the last naval war, and a fleet could now try to overhear the aerial messages of an enemy. In the Russian fleet, the order had been given that no wireless messages were to be sent. In other words, the operators were to keep silence, and listen by watching their apparatus. In the morning of the 26th, they thought they detected messages passing. In the evening, these were more frequent. Short messages of a word or two was the interpretation that the experts in the signal cabins put upon the unintelligible flickerings of the indicator, and they suggested that they were mere negative code signals from the Japanese scouts to their main fleet, repeating an indication that they were on the alert and had seen nothing. This was mere guesswork, however, and Politovsky's diary on the voyage shows that near the Cape, at Madagascar, and out in the midst of the Indian Ocean, Rojdestvensky's wireless operators had thought that they detected Japanese aerial signaling, simply because the receivers gave indications they could not understand. Possibly these were merely the effect of electric storms on the apparatus. Once or twice on 26 May they thought they could read fragments of sentences, such as "last night," "nothing," "11 lights," "not in line." The short messages in the evening came at fixed times. This showed that prearranged signaling was really going on. It gave the impression that perhaps the fleet was being watched by unseen enemies. As the sun went down the ships closed up, and half the officers were detailed for duty at the guns during the hours of darkness. The rest lay down fully dressed, ready to turn out at a moment's notice. Many slept on the decks. No lights were shown. Semenoff's description of that night of anxious expectation is worth quoting. He was on board the flagship, the Suvaroff. The night came on dark. The mist seemed to grow denser, and through it but few stars could be seen. On the dark deck there prevailed a strained stillness, broken at times only by the sighs of the sleepers, the steps of an officer, or by an order given in an undertone. Near the guns the motionless figures of their crews seemed like dead, but all were wide awake, gazing keenly into the darkness. Was not that the dark shadow of a torpedo boat? They listened attentively. Surely the throb of her engines and the noise of steam would betray an invisible foe. Stepping carefully so as not to disturb the sleepers, I went round the bridges and decks, and then proceeded to the engine room. For a moment the bright light blinded me. Here life and movement were visible on all sides. Men were nimbly running up and down the ladders. There was a tinkling of bells and a buzzing of voices. Orders were being transmitted loudly, but on looking more intently, the tension and anxiety, that same peculiar frame of mind so noticeable on deck, could also be observed. At daybreak the Japanese scouts were in touch. As the day came in grey light over the misty broken sea, one of their scouts, the auxiliary cruiser Siano Maru, an armed passenger liner, sweeping round through the haze, almost collided with the hospital ships, and then dashed off and disappeared in the twilight. In former wars she would have had to run back to the fleet with her news. Now from her wireless apparatus the information was sent through the air to the receivers of the Mikasa and Masampo Bay, and in a few moments Togo knew that the enemy's fleet was in square number 203 of the chart, apparently steering for the Eastern Passage, i.e., the strait between Tsu-shima Island and Japan. In the straits and outside Masampo Bay a heavy sea was running, and though the wind blew strongly from the southwest, the weather was still hazy at sunrise, with patches of fog here and there. The main body of the Japanese fleet began to get up anchor and slip from its moorings. At dawn Rojdestvensky had called in the Almaz, leaving the Jemschug and the Izumrud steaming in advance of his two divisions. The 6 auxiliary ships had closed up, so that the leading ship, the transport Anadir, was abreast in the center of the two lines. The Almaz, Svetlana, and Ural steamed at the rear of this central line of transports to protect them in that direction. The 2 hospital ships, flying the Red Cross flag and trusting to it for safety, were well astern. About 6 a.m. the huge Ural came running up between the lines, and semaphored to the flagship that 4 ships in line ahead were passing across the rear of the fleet, but could not be clearly made out in the mist. They could only be some of Togo's cruisers shepherding the fleet. Just before 7, a fine cruiser was seen some 5 miles away on the starboard beam of the Suvaroff. She closed up to 3 miles, and was soon identified as the Idzumo. The big gun turrets were swung round to bear on her, but the Japanese cruiser, having seen what she wanted, increased her distance, but could be seen still keeping the fleet in sight. Togo's report notes that at 7 a.m. the Idzumo sent by wireless the second definite report of the enemy, stating that he was 25 miles northwest of Tsu-shima, steering northeast. This would make the Russian position about 30 miles south of the Tsu-shima Islands, heading for the channel to the east of them. An hour later, about 8 a.m., some Japanese ships showed themselves the other side of the fleet. Semenoff notes how the Chinyen, Matsushima, Itsukushima, and Hashidat appeared out of the mist, steaming on an almost parallel course. Ahead of them was a small light cruiser, apparently the Aki Sushu, which hurriedly drew off to the north as soon as we were able to see her well, and equally she us, and the whole squadron began slowly to increase their distance and gradually to disappear from sight. This was Vice Admiral Takeyomi's division, composed of 3 of the cruisers that had fought at the Yalu battle, 11 years before, and the Chinyen, which had fought against them as the Tingyun. The ship that ran out ahead was the only quick or modern ship in the squadron, the small Clyde-built armored cruiser Chiyoda. If Rojdestvensky had had any speedy cruisers available, he might have severely punished this slow squadron of old ships. Takeyomi showed he knew his enemy by thus boldly approaching in the mist. The Russians now realized that they had watchful enemies all around them, and rightly conjectured that they would find the enemy's heavy ships in the straits ready for battle. At 10 a.m. another cruiser squadron appeared on the port beam. This was Dawa's division, made up of the American-built sister ships Kasagi and Chaitos, of nearly 5,000 tons, and 2 smaller protected cruisers, the Niitaka and Ottawa, lately turned out by Japanese yards. They seemed to invite attack. At a signal from the admiral, the 8 armourclads of the starboard line steamed ahead of the port line, turned together to port, and then, turning again, formed line ahead, leading the whole fleet. At the same time the transports moved out to starboard, guarded by the Vladimir Monomakh detached from the port division, the Svetlana, Almaz, and Ural. Dewa's cruisers held a parallel course with the Russian battleships for more than an hour, still apparently unsupported.